everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Indiana History Project. I'm your guest host, Brad Bough. Today we're going to be talking about newspapers. Did you know that we had 60 newspapers in Lawrence County over the history of the county? I didn't either, but our guest sure did. Our guest today is Jeff Routh from the Times-Mail. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
Quite welcome. It's very interesting, all the newspapers that have been here in the county. Let's start out with you, though. Well, where were you born at?
Okay. I was born at Dunn Hospital here in Bedford, but grew up in the Mitchell area and went to school down there.
A Lawrence County native.
That's right.
After you graduated Mitchell High School, where did you go to college at?
Okay, after I finished up at Mitchell High School in 1977, I went to Rose-Hulman and began working there on a degree in chemical engineering, but that didn't work out so well. I found out I didn't have too good of a math background. I was up against these kids that had gone to much larger high schools and had 3 and 4 years of calculus and chemistry and all those kind of things, and Mitchell wasn't able to offer those back in those days. So I transferred to Indiana University and went a couple of years there before going into the business world.
Okay. And what was your very first job?
Well, one of the first things I did, especially in the newspaper industry, I was what they called a sports correspondent or a stringer for the Times-Mail, and called in sports results and things for, I was a baseball statistician there at Mitchell High School, and I'd every morning when I got to school, I'd head to the office with the scorebook and would call into the sports department at the Times-Mail.
So you were a sports correspondent to start your career out.
Right.
Started on the very bottom.
That's right. And then I came, Claude Parsons, who was the editor at the Times-Mail at the time, he hired me to come into the sports department, and I actually worked in the sports department for about 3 or 4 years, and also was Martin County court reporter. So I'd make a trip down to Shoals a couple of times a week and get the court filings and all that kind of stuff for the newspaper down there.
So you did just about everything from the ground up to where you are today in the newspaper
That's
business.
Right. We had a little publication called Neighbors, or we called it the Moth in-house. It was the Mitchell Orleans Thursday section, so that's where the Moth came from. And I was basically a general assignment reporter for that, would write feature stories and take pictures and collect church news and club news and that type of stuff. And that was some of my first experiences in the newspaper industry.
Well, let's start talking about the newspapers here in the county. 60 newspapers.
Yeah, that seems to be quite a total, but some of them were very short-lived, and they would combine and change names and this, that, and the other over the years. But yeah, there were actually 60 different mastheads in the county over the years.
Well, where are some of the locations that these mastheads were at within the county?
Well, most of them were here in the Bedford area. About 45 to 50 of those were in the Bedford area. Mitchell had seven different newspapers over the years. I think there were 3 in Leesville, and Oolitic had 1, Tunnelton 1, and Heltonville 1.
Tunnelton had a newspaper.
Had its own little newspaper. I think it only lasted about a year or maybe 2 years, but it was out there.
Well, a lot of these towns like Tunnelton, Fort Ritner, located on the railroad tracks.
Right.
Little towns spring up along the railroads, and the news comes in, got to disseminate it to the population.
Right.
Leesville had 3, though, you said.
Yeah, 2 were by the same man, and I think about a year apart, so one of them probably didn't take off too well, so then he decided to do it again. But these were back probably in the 1870s, 1880s time frame, so they were just short-lived little papers.
Short-lived papers.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's another railroad town.
Right.
Bedford was too, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but Mitchell was on the C&O, B&O Railroad.
And Monon.
And Monon, yes. They met there in Mitchell.
Right.
So did that have anything to do with the growth of the papers in that area?
Basically, the paper down there started during the Civil War era. The first papers, the Mitchell Commercial was one of the longest lived down there. And it started up in about 1864, 1865. And in those days, newspapers were very political. And most towns of any size had if they had a paper at all, they probably had 2. They probably had a Republican editorial-based paper and a Democratic-based paper. And it was a funny thing, if you're going back and doing family research and things of that nature, and you're looking at the newspapers, well, your ancestor may not have been in the Republican paper. He may have been in the Democratic paper if he was big in Democratic politics, or vice versa. If he was a Republican, his obituary probably only appeared in the Republican paper and wasn't even mentioned in the Democratic paper. So it happened, Bedford, our paper here at the Times Mail now, you had the Daily Times and you had the Daily Mail. And the Daily Times was Democratic and the Daily Mail was Republican. I believe I've got that right. But and then the two merged into one paper. Paoli, for instance, had the Paola News and the Paola Republican. The News was Democratic. The Republican, of course, is Republican. The Salem Leader and Democrat, the same thing. There was the Republican Leader and the Salem Democrat, the Democratic paper. So today, we don't necessarily think of that, but they were very, very politically based.
All politics is grassroots, as they say. And so, yes, we had very partisan politics right into the towns.
Yeah. I mean, we think we're in a bad political situation now with all the bickering that's going on. But, back then, the news was very political. And if it was in one paper, the other paper probably wouldn't pick it up. So,
very partisan.
Right.
Now, the newspapers here in Bedford, we've had, you said 45 to 50 of those.
Right.
What are some of those newspapers?
There was the Magnet, the Bedford X-Ray, the Enterprise, I've got the Democrat, the Daily Mail, or the Weekly Mail, the Daily Mail. I can't think of all of them off the top of my head, but there were a lot of them, and like I said, many of them were just short-lived. I believe there was maybe a little musical type publication. I know there was one in Mitchell. It was called the Music Monthly, and Mitchell had a little college there. It was called Southern Indiana Normal College. And so one of the professors there was interested in music and that type of thing. So he started a little Music Monthly that operated out of the college. And it was basically published by the commercial, but it was, something from the college. And Bedford had a little business college too, and I think they may have had a publication. And the Old Bedford Seminary, I think it had a publication too. So they were kind of little, we call today niche publications, little to fill a little need in a community.
Yeah, the educational community within the college.
Right.
Now, Mitchell, we've spoke about that. At what point did they add the L or drop the L?
The town is named after a man by the name of Ormsby McKnight Mitchell, and his last name was spelled Mitchel. He was a West Point graduate. He graduated with Robert E. Lee.
1829.
Yep.
Yeah.
And he said he wasn't a very good student. Lee was kind of up at the top of the class.
Number 2.
But Mitchell said he was not that good of a student, so he said he was well down the line. But he was based in Cincinnati. He was a professor at what is now the University of Cincinnati, and was also an astronomer there. And but his main thing, coming out of West Point, he was a surveyor. And so he helped survey the railroad that ran from Cincinnati to St. Louis. And the man who actually platted the town, George Cochran, said, if you do me a plat, I'll name the town after you. But when the town name got recorded in the courthouse at Bedford, it got the second L added. And so the town was always Mitchell with 2 L's, but it is named after a man, Mitchell, with 1 L. And we had Mitchell's sesquicentennial celebration back in 2003. And we had a lady here, and she was his granddaughter-in-law. And so some of the other cousins and such asked her, said, would you like a Mitchell, Indiana t-shirt? And she said, no, they spelled the name wrong. But he was quite a personality, I guess. He was, during the Civil War, he actually invaded Hilton Head area and helped set up a place called Mitchellville on Hilton Head Island. And it was the first experiment in black self-government in the United States. So we're very proud of Mr. Mitchell. 1 L or 2.
Well, that is interesting. Now, Jeff, going back to your particular profession here, how many papers have you been involved with?
Okay, like I said, I basically started at the Times-Mail and worked in the Times-Mail office and also on the Moth, or the Thursday edition. I left there and went to the Mitchell Tribune and worked there for 3 or 4 years. And then at that point in time, the owners of the Tribune, the Grissams, had purchased the Orleans newspaper. So they assigned me to the Orleans office. And I worked down there for a couple of more years before taking over that and running that newspaper on my own for 3 years. And then came back to the Times-Mail in 1990.
So you have been a managing editor of a newspaper.
Editor, publisher. I told everybody I wore every hat from janitor on down, because I said janitor was probably the most appreciated, because you kept the floors clean and stocked the Coke machine and made sure the toilets were clean and all that kind of stuff. So I think that was probably more appreciated sometimes than actually putting out the newspaper.
Well, what are some of the machines or processes that you remember to publish a newspaper?
Okay. When I was at the Tribune, they had a job shop. They printed a lot of letterheads and envelopes and specialty printing for businesses in the community. And they still used a lot of the old equipment that had been used for, at that time, probably 70, 80 years. There was a machine called a linotype, and it did exactly what its name suggests. It produced one single line of type. And you had a keyboard, and you'd set and you would type on it. And a mold for a letter would fall down into the carriage. And when you got to the end of the line, you could actually go in and space it out by hand. It had little spacing bars you could put in. And then you hit a lever, and molten lead filled those molds, and you got a line of type. And then that had to be framed up into the newspaper page. And so it was very labor intensive at that point in time. And that's where the hot off the presses come from, because you were actually dealing in hot metal type. There were also, we had a Heidelberg press, and it was an old, what they called a windmill press, and it had like 4 stations. And it would pick up the paper here, and then it would rotate down and go into the print area, and then it would rotate over again, and that would be the resting area, and then it would release it, and that way it had a chance to dry before they stacked on top of each other. And it made some of the most wonderful noises. I loved to hear that old Heidelberg, because it had a suction, a piston firing, and it was very fun to listen to. And even back before that, they actually did everything by hand. They had individual letters. You had what was called a type case, and it was probably about that high. And you had drawers, and it had little compartments for the letters. And you'd pull out those letters. But you were actually working upside down and backwards, putting those together. And so minding your P's and Q's, because if you look at a P and a Q, it would look alike. And you were working upside down and backwards, because you had it in front of you here. And so you were putting the letters in. So B's and D's and P's and Q's all look alike. And there was a headline that was up on the Tribune wall, and it said "Webbing Dells" instead of "Wedding Bells." So somebody had reversed it. But at that time, we didn't have the presses that run 12 and 15, 20,000 an hour like they have today. You had a flatbed press, and you put the newspaper frame in, and you actually hand-fed the sheets of paper into it. You had the full newspaper size sheets. So if you had a mistake like that, it was much easier to correct. Today, by the time they fire up the press and you find a mistake, you may have already wasted 8,000 to 10,000 newspaper images before you catch that mistake. So, and then when I got into up at the Times-Mail, we got all our national news through a teletype. And if those of you who are familiar with teletype machines, it looked kind of like a typewriter, but it would start vibrating and had a round carriage in it, and it would print out what was coming in off the wire service. So the AP had that. And it would print out also just like a narrow tape, just like a key punch tape would be. And they could run that through a reader, and that would go in and print out the copy for the newspaper. And that teletype machine, it had a flashing red light and bells that would go off when major breaking news would happen. And Vicki Mitchell, who worked at the office for many years, she said she remembers the day that Kennedy was shot. The teletype started going off a little after noon, and she said it didn't shut up the rest of the afternoon. It was just constantly, you'd hear bing, 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 and the red light would go off, and here would come a bulletin, the president had been shot, and then, the president was taken to the hospital, and, eventually the president had died, and all those were coming across this little machine, but it had that warning on it that, you could know that something important was happening somewhere in the world. So, but today we get most of that kind of stuff. You get it through satellite. It goes directly into your computer feed. And back when I first started at the paper, you actually did paste up. I mean, you got a long strip of copy came out of this machine. I told you fed the ticker tape through, and then it would read that, and it would print you out a 1 column width piece of copy. And if the story was 15 or 20 inches long, that's how long that strip of paper would be. And you ran that through a waxer, and then you took your scissors and cut it and actually pasted it and broke it up and put it on the newspaper page. And then you wrote your headlines separately. You had a separate machine, and you'd go over there and type your headlines, and it would come out in a single strip, and that had to be waxed and placed on the paper. Today, that's all done on computers. You get the story feed coming in from the satellite, and you have a dummy of your page there on the computer. You put the copy where you want it and click a button, and it flows in, and then you can manipulate it a little bit and write your headlines, and if there's a photo that goes with it, you attach that. And so it's come a long way in the last 25 years, where everything was done by hand. It's mostly done by computers now.
So the term mind your P's and Q's actually come from the newspaper business.
Because if you look at a P and a Q,
absolutely,
they're identical, just one's standing upright and one's descending below the line, and but you've got to watch it. So you got to mind your P's and Q's.
Another educational experience here. I've always wondered where that came from. I've always heard it, mind your P's and Q's, but never knew.
It's it's a kind of a wacky statement.
What does it mean?
Right.
But now we know what it means.
Right.
Also, you spoke about mistakes on the newspaper. Obviously, nothing as glaring as Dewey defeats Truman.
Right.
But what are some of the more memorable mistakes? You mentioned the one.
Yeah, that was when I was at the Orleans paper. One of the first weeks we did it, typing up a headline, and instead of typing Clarksville, I typed Blarksville. And so there it is in bold print. So that just became a joke with us at the office, that you watched for Blarksvilles. And so, and I remember one time when back, it's probably been 30 or more years ago now, Bob Bridge, the sports editor at the time, had gone on vacation, so I was subbing in and doing the pages. And we'd gotten a photo off the AP wire service, and so I had the cut line in and that photo blocked in. Well, there was some problem with the photo. One of the pieces hadn't come through, because if you're doing a color photo, you have, a black piece, a yellow piece, a blue piece, and a red piece that all come together to form that color image. And there was an error, or one of them was damaged or something, so we had to switch photos. Well, we switched photos, but I didn't go back and switch the cut line. So we had a different player from a different team and a different race, if I'm not mistaken. So I made a major mistake because just because that one photo didn't work. So, you make mistakes.
We're all human. We
That's
make
right.
mistakes. So now, talking about the local papers and so on, do you know anybody that's on the voting committees? I know they use reporters a lot for like the Baseball Hall of Fame, things like that.
Bob Bridge is still on the Heisman.
Heisman, okay.
He still votes on the Heisman. And there may be other couple of sports awards that he is still associated with, because he was a sports writer for 20 years or more. And but yeah, he was on the Heisman list, and but I don't know of anybody locally that's on the major things like baseball MVPs or anything like that. But the Heisman is a pretty prestigious award.
Absolutely. So. It's the oldest college sports award, as I recall.
I think that's right.
Now, You have worked at the Times-Mail. What is your current position at the Times-Mail?
Well, I'm basically just a staff writer, but I do compile the obituaries every morning, so that's one of my major. So I had to bug out just a little bit early. My deadline at 9 o'clock, and that's about the time I had to be here, so I had to duck out a little bit early this morning to get here. But I do, like I said, the obituaries. I handle the births, the weddings, all that type of stuff, plus do general assignment reporting and feature writing, and occasionally snap a picture or two. We all wear many hats. When you're a small staff, you got to be multifaceted.
Flexible.
That's right.
Now, who are some of the memorable people that you've worked with over the years? There's a lot of the fellows that have been at the Times-Mail are part and parcel of the history here in Bedford.
That's right.
Ray Snapp is one that I remember.
Yeah, Ray actually hired me. He was just about to retire, and like I said, I was basically a Mitchell sports correspondent, and a friend of mine actually worked at the newspaper, and that's what he did. He covered Mitchell sporting events, and I was his statistician, so he and I would travel all over southern Indiana to ball games and everything, and so I was hanging around with him at the office and figuring up all the stats and everything. So when he decided to change majors and go into radio and television, they hired me to take his place. And so Ray hired me back, gosh, that would have been back in 79 was when Ray hired me. And then Ray retired shortly after that, and then I worked for Claude Parsons for many years, and Claude just passed away a year or so ago, but he was a very good person to work for, was very easy to get along with. Then Norma Hutchinson, she took over after that, and then we had Fred Timby came in here probably back in the early 80s, maybe 83, 84, and he was another a good man to work for. But now I work with Mike Lewis, and Mayor Maloney is our publisher out of Bloomington. So, and we are owned by Schurz Communication, which is a nationwide company that's actually based here in Indiana. They have the South Bend, Mishawaka papers, and as well as Martinsville, Mooresville, Bloomington, and us here in Indiana. So, but we have holdings in California and Florida, Maryland, Kentucky. We're all over, Aberdeen, South Dakota. We got people everywhere. So.
And that corporation bought the newspaper, was it 1966?
I
think that's what you...
Mid to early 60s, yeah. And before that, it was owned by the Rileys. Stuart and Dagmar Riley owned the paper, and they are actually the ones that brought about the merger between the two existing papers back in the 1940s. The Times-Mail can trace its history back to 1884, and that's when the Lawrence Mail, I believe it was, started and was published first in 1884. And then the Bedford Democrat, which became the Times, was formed the following year in 1885. And so those two papers existed as weekly publications at that point in time. And then they switched over to daily publication somewhere around 1900. It may have been late 1800s, but around 1900, they switched to daily publications. And those two papers continued until about 1942-43, in that era, when those two papers were merged to become the Times-Mail that we know today.
Now, you said you were born at Dunn Hospital.
Right.
Is that a little coincidence there, perhaps, the profession you chose? We can talk about that a little bit.
I don't know about that. I really didn't know, that I would get into this, but it's something that I've really enjoyed over the years. And we, growing up in Mitchell, and like I said, I didn't write for the high school newspaper or anything. My first real at college, I guess, was really my first experience. We had it was a little bit kind of like a satirical newspaper at Rose-Hulman. They had an actual newspaper called The Thorn, Rose and Thorns. And so this one kid was he was a little bit out there, I guess you'd say. And he's formed the Thorn with two R's. And it was Terre Haute's Really Redundant Newspaper. That's what Thorn stood for. And so I worked for him and on that satirical paper. But he told me, he said, you take it too seriously. He said that we're lighthearted and fun with this satirical paper. He said you need to kind of go into the straight journalism, and that's what kind of inspired me as a freshman in college at an engineering school to become a newspaper writer. So it's kind of funny how your paths can change like that.
Now, what did the Dunns have to do with the local papers?
Not a whole lot, really. The Dunns were wealthy landowners and philanthropists, but Fred Otis was really the man who Otis Park is named after, was really instrumental in the newspaper business. He worked for the Lawrence Mail. He started out, as a pressman. And it was funny to see some of these old pictures of the press people. It's a dirty job, and we provide uniforms for our press people now because they're covered with ink from head to toe, and you would really ruin your own clothing. So we provide coveralls through a service. Well, back then these guys came in their white shirts and ties to run the presses, and so you'll see these old pictures of these guys in their button-down white shirts running a press, and you just can't imagine that today. But Fred started in that as what they call a printer's devil, basically chasing copy and doing edit work and all that kind of stuff, and then actually started running the presses, and then basically he ran the papers, or he ran the mail, or gotta get first. Yes, he ran the mail, probably until around 1940. And then that's when he sold it to the Rileys and that partnership. So it's really the Otises that had more to do with the paper. And he was born in Connecticut and moved here, and but he left a legacy of Otis Park that we still enjoy today.
The golf course and all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what, he passed in 1941?
In the early 40s, I believe.
So that was right about the time the newspapers were...
I think they sold I think his estate actually sold the papers to the Rileys.
Okay. And who are the Rileys? Are they from around here? Or we have like James Whitcomb Riley, but not the same family,
It's not the same family. I believe they came here from Illinois. And... they were newspaper people, and this paper became available, and I believe they bought the Mail first, and then they purchased the Times a little bit later, and then they basically merged the two papers in the 40s, and it became the Bedford Daily Times Mail at that point in time. Now we just call it the Times Mail because we serve more than just Bedford. We serve, the Lawrence and Orange County areas specifically, and we go some into Washington and Jackson and Martin counties as well. But,
yeah, I see the police logs from the different counties.
Mm-hmm. So.
Well, let's start talking about some of the pictures you've brought in today.
Just as we did a book back celebrating our 100th anniversary, and some of these headlines are out of that. It kind of shows the changes over the years, but this one here, I guess, I believe that's declares war on Germany. I think that's the start of World War I, probably, just from looking at it. And you can kind of look at the headlines, how they may have changed. The masthead as well is quite a lot different. But if you look, a lot of times back in the older papers, the headlines were all caps. And that's something we don't do today unless it's the first word we capitalize, and if it's some sort of a proper name or whatever, they all do caps. But and then this, I think, is start of World War II, right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. If you look at the first one, it was basically a graphic of a flag. By this time, the technology advanced between the two wars, and you were able to get better pictures and things like that. So I think that's a picture of Pearl Harbor right after.
Not all caps on this one.
Yeah, not all caps, no. So you can see just in that 20, 25 year period, a major change in the style of newspapers.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, this is one of the older ones we have in the book. That's from the Bedford Democrat, and that's back before the turn of the century, back before the night. That's the late 1800s. That issue is so. Kind of gives you a different and they used a different type of script on the headline there too, on the masthead. Okay, this was our centennial edition. About the same time we came out with this book, we came out with the centennial edition. You can see at this point you've got a color graphic up there, so the use of color came in a little bit more. If you look to the right side of that picture, I think that's Marmaduke, who was, I believe that's right.
Mandrake.
Mandrake, not Marmaduke.
It's hard to see
yeah,
up
it
there.
is.
With the lights in your eyes, I can
right.
understand it.
But during that week, we had these centennial editions, and the various comic strip people actually did a greeting to the Times Mail, and so that's happened to be the Mandrake that was that day. So, but you can see the use of color and how that changed. Okay, this is a very important day in Lawrence County history when Grissom was killed.
And there again, all caps.
Yeah. Now that's
a special.
That's a.
And you don't see stars either.
What we call in the business the end of the world headline.
Yeah, that it pretty much was here in Lawrence County.
Yeah, that was a major day in January of '67.
Yeah, January 27th.
Mm-hmm. And so that was, and then this is actually one of our Sunday pieces, but this was the day after the June 2nd tornadoes in 1990.
Yes.
Yeah, and so you can see how large, again, a large photo, pretty big headline there stating,
Right, I remember that was on a Saturday.
Saturday
Yes.
evening. I was sitting at my house in Mitchell, and the phones went dead. And at that time, your answering machine, when it lost its power and everything, it just screamed, it screeched, and that was, the first, in Mitchell, it was a bright, sunny day. I mean, you looked outside, and, it was a perfect afternoon. And then, but the power went off, the phones went dead, all that, and then a little bit later, a friend of mine came by, and he said, I heard there was tornado warning, so he said I was heading out to my folks' place, and they lived out on Woods Ferry Road, there by the junction. And he said the only way I can describe it is the junction's gone. It's just not there. And so I didn't see it until Monday. I was at the Progress Examiner in Orleans at that time, and part of my duties was to do advertising sales. So I had a sales route in Bedford and Salem, and so Monday was my day to go to Bedford and Mitchell and pick up ads. And so that was my first view of it, looking, and like he said, basically the junction just wasn't there anymore.
Goodness.
So.
Yes, that was a very trying event for the entire county.
Mm-hmm.
I remember it broke the old myth that tornadoes can't cross rivers because it went straight across the White River.
Yeah.
Came pretty much up Leatherwood Creek, as I'm recalling.
Mm-hmm.
Hit Pride Estates
Right. Yeah.
trailer park, I believe.
Right.
But
So.
would you like to hold that up and show it to the camera?
Okay.
And if there's any particular photos in there you'd like to show?
I was going to show the if I can find it real quick, when Kennedy was killed.
Oh, okay.
But who knows if I can find it real quick or not.
We'll go with that.
How's that for that?
1983, yes.
Yeah.
First state championship.
Yeah, so that's that, and you've got Marine bombing and such there.
I remember that one. I was
Right, you were probably involved in military at that point in time.
Yeah, 1983.
Yeah, and then
I believe it was October 23rd.
there's the Mount St. Helens eruption.
Oh, yes.
So if you'll
That
look,
was 1980, wasn't it?
Right.
May 18th, yes.
so you'll look in a lot of these older papers, you'll find that we had a lot more national and state news than we have today, just because we want to focus locally.
Well, there's Nixon is resigning.
Yeah, Nixon resigning today. Today, with all the different ways you can get your news and information, by the time you print a newspaper, it's outdated news. So we try to not focus as much on the national and state stuff, but and focus more on what's happening in our communities. And that way, it's fresher. It's Because, I mean, if something like this, Nixon resigning,
Sure.
you're going to know it on CNN or Fox or whatever your affiliation is on where you get your national news. Even your phone feeds,
With Yahoo or AOL as your homepage, you're going to get that
you get all
headline
that
the minute you
stuff.
sign on.
But yeah, there's Senator Kennedy, when Bobby was shot and killed. And, he had just been here in Bedford.
Absolutely.
About 5 or 6 weeks before that. He was here just before the May primary, I think the last week of April. And then he was shot in early June in California.
He campaigned pretty heavy here in Indiana. He was in Indianapolis the night that Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis.
There we go. And and you can kind of see this is when President Kennedy was killed, so.
That was what you were talking about, the bells going off.
The bells and the teletype
the
going crazy.
office.
I just wanted to show maybe a little bit different aspect. We try to be a little bit more politically correct today than necessarily what they were, but Roosevelt drops dead.
Yeah. Now my grandma used to say that Kennedy was a shock, but the one that really brought home the fact that we were one nation was when Roosevelt died. Well, obvious reasons, we're still fighting World War II. And Truman had to step in and assume the reins of power.
Right.
But yes, you're correct. You could never put that in a paper today.
Yeah. So the rules have changed a little bit. You'll see some of the what we today consider very offensive language, but that was just the status quo at the time. And so it's not saying it's right, but that's just the way it is, and that's part of our history. And there's nothing we can do to go back and change it. It's there. That's one thing, you can't change history. You can do what you can to correct what happened, but you can't change it. Once it happens, it's happened.
Learn from the past, or you're destined to repeat it.
That's right. So, but this book is available at the museum for people to look at up in the Hutton Library upstairs. So if people are interested in looking at some of this newspaper history over the years, they're welcome to stop by the museum and look at it.
Well, you mentioned the Edward L. Hutton Museum or the Edward L. Hutton Library at the County Museum.
Right.
You're not allowed to check anything out of there, correct?
No. It's just a research library. You can actually go there and do family history research, and they've got vertical files on various family names, and they've got some published works, some non-published works. There are census records. There are obituary clippings from the early 1900s. They've got some from the Bedford papers, some from the Mitchell papers, some from other papers that people have collected over the years. We've got a pretty big collection of yearbooks over there. So we've got some of the like Shoswick, Tunnelton, Olytic yearbooks, as well as the North Lawrence and Bedford yearbooks and Mitchell yearbooks. So it's a good way for kids to go see what their parents looked like when they were in high school, and sometimes even their grandparents, what they looked like in high school. That was always one of the fun things for kids when they came through on tours. When I got help with that over at the museum, they wanted to look at those yearbooks and see what their folks looked like when they were in high school. So that was.
So if you need to research anything about Lawrence County, Edward L. Hutton Museum or Edward L. Hutton Library at the County Museum. I'll get it right one of these days. But if you need to, go on up there and have a look. And if you haven't been to the Lawrence County Museum, I would challenge any county our size to even say they have anything that compares to what we have here in this county.
That's true. We've got a tremendous museum and library, thanks to the generosity of Mr. Hutton, who was a county native and went to school here and during the Depression, and then went on to IU and then joined the Army during World War II. And he was in like procurement. And one of his duties was getting potash from the Soviet Union to Japan after the bombings to help build back up their soil and stuff after the nuclear bombings there. And he said the government wasn't the most effective at getting that to happen, so they turned it over to him as an individual to run it. So he said he made his first million selling potash from the Soviet Union to Japan, and he went on, he was a partner in the Guggenheim funds and all that kind of stuff, and ended up being a very, very wealthy man, and he, remembered his roots here and his roots in Greene County, and endowed, IU, there's a Hutton Honors College up there now that's named after him, and there's Hutton Scholars here at B&L School, and so, he kind of remembered his roots. And you talk about the importance of education. This was a man who came from a very poor family. He laughed and joked and said they lived in every rental property in Bedford during the Depression, because when the rent came due, they had to move. But he was a good student and got a scholarship to go to IU. But the problem was he didn't have the money for room and board. And there was a family here in Bedford that he had worked for and lived with. And that man was a mechanic at the Chevy garage here in town. And the man got laid off, or his job ceased to exist in Bedford. And he got a call from the Chevy garage in Bloomington. And so he ends up moving to Bloomington, and then Mr. Hutton just continues to live with them up there. And so, you can overcome some of the obstacles and still get an education and go on to do great things in this world.
There again, education, very important. Now, Mr. Hutton was from this county, and he was in World War II.
Right.
And helped reconstruct Japan.
Yes, through the potash, yeah.
Can't very well reconstruct without growing crops.
Right.
Got to feed your population.
The soil was so damaged in those areas surrounding the nuclear bombs, I guess, for miles and miles and miles, that radiation traveled out and damaged the soil. And so therefore he was able to take the potash, which the Soviets had in large quantities, and was able to help reconstruct Japan through that effort.
I have been to the Chernobyl Museum in Kiev, Ukraine, and it's just absolutely stunning how many people died as a result of that one accident at that small nuclear power plant area. It was just one reactor went haywire, and
so you could imagine
I could imagine what a nuclear device detonating would do to a civilian population, just based upon the fact that this nuclear radiation spread out in that area. Now, you have been with the Times-Mail how many years now?
Well,
or should we say the newspaper business? How many years have you been in it?
Newspaper business since 1979.
79.
So I've been off and on from that point on. Like I said, I was with the Times-Mail for a while at that point in time, then with the Mitchell and Orleans newspapers. Then I came back to the Times-Mail in November of 1990. So I've completed 22 years this stint, and I'm in my 23rd year at the present time.
23 years with the Times-Mail.
Yeah. And you have done various things. At one point in time I was taking classified line ads. People would call in or walk in with their yard sales or items for sale or cars or whatever it may be, and you actually would sit there and type all that stuff in. And it was all by their phone number. So you had the phone number record, and so if they wanted to rerun an ad or whatever, it was all recorded by a phone number. Not necessarily the name, but the phone number. And so I think they still pretty much do that today. I think it's still done by the phone number. And then I've actually sold advertising for the Times-Mail, and worked on various special products. We had a thing called Lawrence County or Bedford Monthly, and the South Central Indiana Business Journal. We had a tourism publication called Discover Indiana, and it covered everything from like the I-70 corridor south. Lawrence County Visitor Guide. We do an Orange County Community Guide. All these things I've worked on over the years. I talked earlier about niche publications, and Bedford was good with niche publications. We had lots of them. We specialized. We had medical publications and fire and police for like Fire Protection Week. We had a fire tab, and we had the pictures of the firemen and stories about how you could protect yourself against fire. We had crime prevention tabs where we had all the local police officers in them, and gave you tips to make yourself safer, in your home or in the vehicles or whatever. But over the years, those have kind of died down as the industry has changed and everything has kind of tightened up monetarily, with the recessions and everything. So we've cut back a lot on those special publications. So that's when I made the switch more into the news room part of the equation. Probably for the first 10 or 12 years of my tenure, this time from 1990 on, I was actually in the advertising department. That's where my salary came out of their budget and not the newsroom budget. But that changed probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I switched over into the newsroom portion and have been there ever since.
Now, newspapers, as I understand it, that is the only profession that is specifically protected in the U.S. Constitution. Is that correct?
I believe it is. With the freedom of the press, and I think we're kind of having some discussion about that right now with the subpoena of the AP phone records and all that kind of stuff. Is that stepping on freedom of the press? And that's yet to be determined at this point in time. But some people, think freedom of the press, that is a personal right, and it's really not. It's the freedom of the newspaper to act without fear of repercussion from the government. So, in our country, we can say, if we don't like the president, we can say that, we don't like what his policies, we don't like that. In some countries, if you spoke out against that, off with your heads or whatever. So it's the freedom of that newspaper to be able to publish the news without fear of repercussion. Whatever, opinions are protected usually other ways, but that newspaper can publish without fear of the government trying to come in and shut them down. It doesn't give you the right to put anything you want in the newspaper. It doesn't give me the right to put whatever I want in the newspaper. But it's if the government messed up and they did something, we can say that they messed up and without fear of losing our heads.
Print an opinion about the way the government is functioning.
Right. But but even if the government has broken a law, we can say that and say that opinions are protected more under free speech. You have an opinion and you can put a letter to the editor that that's your opinion, or I can do the same, or we can write as our editorial board, we can take a stance on something, but that's opinion, and that's protected under the freedom of speech, but where the newspaper can publish these things without fear of repercussions.
It's freedom of the press.
Right, that's freedom of the press.
Of course, slanderous and libel statements can still be held against a
Right.
newspaper.
But you've got to prove malice, that that you did it to really hurt someone, where where you can get by with as a public official. There are certain things you come to expect as part of your duties. If you're the president or you're the governor or you're the mayor, you can expect you're going to get some criticism. So, but you've got to say that we went out of our way to intend, malicious intent, I guess. So, but it occasionally happens, but you don't see too many times that the newspaper is sued and the person wins against them.
It's the situation with Dan Rather. It's not necessarily the press, but it is the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
journalism.
Yeah.
He had a situation where he did not use due diligence
Right.
in checking out his story, and it came back to haunt him in the end.
Right.
I can't recall the exact year that happened.
Yeah, I
but
don't know exactly either, but sometime in the around 2000, late 90s, early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken.
Now, have you or any of the reporters done any type of extensive travel to report for the local paper, or do you rely on others to do that for you?
Well, most of the national news and things like that come through AP, UPI, Associated Press, United Press International, Scripps Howard, one of the national news services. There are pool reporters and pool photographers that cover the globe. So we don't necessarily send folks out to that. We used to, for sports though, we had somebody locally, mainly Bob Bridge, that would travel, all over the country covering IU sports. So in the Bloomington paper, our sister paper up there, had Bob Hamill and some of those guys that would travel. They would, would follow the team all over. And they still do to an extent. We did it more when Damon and our association was a little closer with IU than it is today. But, so we had our own take on it as well as the Bloomington paper. And they would, travel to all the Big Ten schools, and they would go. I know Bob covered the Maui Classic, so he was in Hawaii, and so Bob and some of the sports people have traveled quite a lot. And we still, on local sports, we do send reporters out to cover games. We don't travel as much as we used to just because of the budgetary constraints. Gas isn't cheap, and a trip to Jeffersonville for a 2-hour ball game is can be kind of expensive. But we still do for the important events, such as we had folks follow the Stars all the way this year, the Lady Stars all the way to the state championship. So we had reporters and photographers there for those games as they traveled through the tournament. So we do send them out to that extent, but we don't cover what you consider national news, because that can come from other sources.
I remembered like Channel 13 at the Olympics and things like that. And of course we had the big papers were in Afghanistan.
Right.
And I would see national reporters, famous national reporters, you just pass them by on one of the FOBs or the camps that you were on. Say, oh, I know that person from the TV.
Right.
But I knew obviously you didn't go internationally, but you answered the question.
Okay.
Seems I remember about Bob Bridge going to the Maui Classic back when. But that's been several years ago.
Yes, it has.
You got some other books here. You want to share those with the viewers?
This is just something that I fall back on a little bit, and that's where I got some of the information I sent to you.
Oh.
That's brain game program from last night. We produced this, I think this one was 1990, and it just, we did 2 different versions of this. This is the second version, I believe, but it just goes through, and it's got, like I said, the information on the newspapers and who their founders were, Chamber of Commerce information, little highlights of Lawrence County history through the years. We just have a little bit of everything in there. Elected officials, statistics on manufacturing and employment.
Kind of a walk down memory lane through.
Well, it just like answers to funny questions or things that aren't on the tip of your tongue every day. Who was mayor back in 1925? That probably not going to come to you off the top of your head. But we had a list of everybody who was Mitchell mayor, everybody that was Bedford mayor. In one of them, I don't know if it's this one, we had results of the several elections, even local elections. We had sports statistics for all the various teams. And so just trivia knowledge, basically all in one little place where you could go and get it and put your hands on it pretty easily. The one funny little thing is there was 2 Stipps. There was Thomas Stipp, and I believe the other one was John Stipp. And one was mayor of Bedford, and the other was mayor of Mitchell at the same time. So you had brothers who were mayors.
Mayor Stipp.
Yeah, Mayor Stipps. Or no, it was W.E. Stipp in Mitchell, excuse me. I think it was John in Bedford. And so you had brothers who were of the 2 major communities they were mayors of both municipalities. So Bedford has been a city longer than Mitchell, so they've obviously had more mayors than Mitchell has had. Mitchell didn't become a city until about 1909, but Bedford dates back to the late 1800s as a city. So little facts like that you can find out in books like that. So it's kind of like a world almanac, but just make it for Lawrence County.
Yeah, I do good to remember that Calvin Coolidge was our president in 1925, let alone who our mayor in Bedford was back then.
It was kind of, there was a man from Mitchell, his last name was Edwards, and he had been state politician and had served in the state legislature. And he was friends, now the guy's name's going to escape me, who was, he was pretty big politically in the state. And so he becomes part of the Harding administration in 1920. And so Mr. Edwards goes with him and becomes solicitor for the Post Office Department and Assistant Secretary of the Interior, I believe was his office. But the guy, his friend, ends up leaving, and he becomes the man who sets up the Motion Picture Rating Association. I can't think of what the man, his last name was, but that is known as the Motion Picture Rating Association of America. So, you know, here's this little guy from Mitchell who ends up being part of the Harding administration, and then his buddy goes off to Hollywood to head up the Motion Picture Association rules. So, you know, there's little things like that in Lawrence County history that people don't realize that are out there. And so little stuff like that can be found in this book.
All right. Well, we're running out of time
Okay.
here. And I want to thank you very much for coming on the program today, Jeff.
Thank you for
Jeff
asking me.
Routh from the Times-Mail. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
It's been very informative. We've watched our P's and Q's, I think.
Hopefully.
I want to remind everyone to like us on Facebook. Thank you again for tuning in. This is Brad Bough, your guest host, reminding you that if you love your freedom, to thank a veteran. So long, everyone.